I'll say some words and then you guys can.
You want to say some words?
Well, good evening, everyone. So this is the famed number 3. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Morven. We're delighted to have you here this evening, and we're extra delighted to have Ms. Bundles here to tell us about Villa Lewaro and her ancestors and all that went on, and the excitement and the beauty and the struggle. And welcome to Morven, to our Grand Homes and Gardens, the second lecture of our 3rd series. The Grand Homes and Garden series was born from a committee meeting where someone said, we need a signature event, and Jill has made it happen. And congratulations and many thanks to Jill Barry, our executive director, whose brainchild this largely is, and it has been fabulous. And tonight's lecture is sponsored by Capital Health, and we're thrilled that they were kind enough to sponsor tonight's lecture. But we have a couple of trendsetters and trailblazers who've sponsored the whole series, and that's Nick and Jennifer Hilton of Hilton's here in Princeton. And we're thrilled and very grateful that they are helping us out and sponsoring our series this year. And yes, that we'll give them a round of applause. You'll be hearing from Nick in a moment. And we hope that you will enjoy this and find many other things about Morven, and bring your friends and come back and join us again and again, because we love having you here and we're delighted to have the show this evening. So I'll introduce Nick Hilton to say a few words to you.
Hi. I'm Nick Hilton, and I'm grateful to be here and proud to sponsor this series. I have to admit, I admitted last week, so this is, I just admit this every week. It'll give me something to say. That I don't really know that much about Morven, but and so I had to learn something about it to stand up here and say, yes, we're sponsoring this. Jennifer and I Jennifer probably knows more about it than, she knows more about houses and gardens than I will ever know. Anyway, but I was fascinated by last week's presentation, and I trust that I will be again tonight. And I'm actually touched a bit that I guess we've just finished Black History Month, but it's a good thing, I think, to have Morven in that association, and I'm particularly proud to be here. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Greer Luce. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs here at Morven, and I'm really excited to introduce tonight's speaker. As we talked about last week, the theme of this year's Grand Homes and Gardens series is trailblazers and trendsetters. Tonight's program is no exception. As Nick mentioned, tonight's program is especially timely as we come to the end of Black History Month and the start of Women's History Month. Today, we're going to learn about the Gilded Age estate and the incredible life of self-made millionaire and African-American beauty entrepreneur, Madam C.J. Walker. I do want to mention that I hope you will all join us for the next program in this series next week, which will feature Beauport, the Sleeper McCann House. We will explore unique and ornate designs in the summer home of one of America's first professional interior designers, Henry Davis Sleeper. But now for this evening's program. I'm excited to introduce A'Lelia Bundles. A'Lelia Bundles is the author of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, a New York Times notable book about her entrepreneurial great-great-grandmother and the inspiration for Self-Made, the fictional Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer, which is really good if you haven't had a chance to see it. And hopefully we can talk a little bit about it tonight. She is the founder of the Madam Walker Family Archives and brand historian for Madam by Madam C.J. Walker, a line of hair care products developed in partnership with Unilever, Sundial Brands, and Walmart. She serves on several nonprofit boards, including the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute, the March on Washington Film Festival, Indiana Landmarks, the Women's Suffrage National Monument Foundation, and the Smithsonian's American Women's History Initiative. A former network television executive, an Emmy Award-winning producer at ABC News and NBC News, she is a chair emerita of the National Archives Foundation and a vice chair emerita of Columbia University. My pleasure to introduce A'Lelia Bundles.
Thank you very much, Greer. So I got an email from Greer, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 months ago, because they plan ahead. And doesn't she have the most wonderful name? Greer Luce. So I was all in. Anytime there's a chance to talk about Madam Walker and Villa Lewaro. So Mr. Hilton, you said you didn't know a lot about this particular estate, but don't we all watch Home and Garden television? I'm hooked. I don't know why it's so formulaic, but I just can't wait to see which house they're going to pick and how they're going to redo it. But again, thank you, Greer. Thank you, Jill, for having me. Thank you, Joe, for making sure that my slides are here. I worked in television for a long time, so I always like to make sure I recognize the technical person because it can make or break you. I happen to have been in Irvington, New York last night, the same village where Madam Walker's home, Villa Lewaro, stands. And I was there because the village trustees and the mayor voted to name the plaza in front of the town hall Madam Walker Plaza. So more than 100 years later, I think when she moved in, there had been some covenants in Irvington and in Westchester County that didn't necessarily welcome her, but things have really changed. She is very much embraced by the community, the Irvington Historical Society, the Westchester Historical Society, the public library, the town trustees really do celebrate Madam Walker's legacy. So that was just a very moving moment for me. The house is now owned by Richelieu Dennis. And Richelieu's story is worth your hearing. Richelieu came to the United States from Liberia to go to Babson College in Wellesley, Massachusetts, in the late 1980s, and he graduated in 1992. His mom came from Liberia for his graduation. They could not go back to Liberia because of the Civil War, but he had to figure out how to make a living. So they put together his Sierra Leonean grandmother's shea butter recipe and started selling it on the corner of 125th and 5th. Now, shea butter is in everything now, right? You didn't know what it was 27 years ago when they started. But Richelieu created a very successful company, which he sold to Unilever a few years ago. He's still chairman of the board, but now he has taken some of those proceeds and bought Essence and Essence Fest and created a $100 million venture capital fund, especially focused on women entrepreneurs. They just rang the bell at the NASDAQ a couple of weeks ago because he had invested in companies like Lip Bar and Mael, which was just sold to Procter & Gamble. So he's now an investor. But among the things that he did was reach out to me after he bought the trademark for the Madam Walker name and hair care products. My family was very involved through the 1980s. There was another interim owner for about 30 years, and they never went out of business, but they weren't a major player. But Rich had heard of Madam Walker in Liberia and wondered what was happening with the brand. So he bought the trademark and then reached out to me and asked me to be the brand historian. So I'm not a chemist, but I am the storyteller who has worked for many years, almost 50 years, in telling the story. So now I'm very excited and delighted that he and his family now own Villa Lewaro. And they are doing, the previous owners, Harold and Helena Doley, did a lot of restoration. They own the house for 25 years. But you know, as people who are here know, a house that's more than 100 years old, there's always something. So I was there a couple of weeks ago and the boiler had just gone out. But there's a great architectural preservationist, Steve Tilley, who is doing all of the meticulous restoration. So the house is in good hands. I'm glad that I get to visit there. And I'm glad that there's somebody who stewards the house and cares enough about it. So I just wanted to sort of set the stage for you. I mean, it's a magical house. And this, to tell Madam Walker's story. So many of you, some of you may have seen the Netflix series. So I'm glad Greer enjoyed it. I have mixed emotions. I can answer some questions. Octavia Spencer was great. I didn't really love the script. I argued against the things that they did, but more people know Madam Walker's name, so that goes along with the territory. But Madam Walker's story is a story, a great American rags to riches story. So this is the very famous picture of her on the right and her daughter on the left, and it is very much a mother-daughter story. She was born on this plantation in Delta, Louisiana. So you see, she came from that to this mansion that she built. Born in 1867 on the same plantation where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. They were owned by the R.W. Birney family, and that plantation happened to have been the staging area for the siege of Vicksburg during 1863 and 1864. Well, for me, that was a bonus because it meant that there were a lot of records, a lot of war records, and I could tell what was going on in the plantation. And I subsequently met some of the descendants of the owners, and we are actually in touch with each other. We've had lunch and dinner together, and one of the descendants who's now deceased came to the signing ceremony for the Madam Walker stamp in 1998. So we have developed a relationship. But their family had some tragedy too, not exactly the same thing as being enslaved, but they went through their own tragedy. But Madam Walker, born Sarah Breedlove in Delta, Louisiana, first child in her family born free, but her parents died when she was 7. So now she's an orphan. She moved in with an older sister who she said the brother-in-law was so cruel. She said that I got married at 14 to get a home of my own, to escape the treatment of my cruel brother-in-law. She married a man named Moses McWilliams. They had one daughter named Lelia, who I'm named after. And then when she was 20, Moses died. So now she was clearly not moving back in with the sister and brother-in-law, but she moved up the river to St. Louis, up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, where her brothers had migrated a decade earlier as part of one of the early migrations of African Americans who realized that sharecropping was never going to get them anywhere. And her brothers followed this sort of millenarian movement and stopped in Vicksburg, where they became barbers and where they joined St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. And if you know anything about the history of the AME church, you know that that was a church that even during slavery was teaching people to read and write, that the leadership was more educated, that they had missionaries in Africa. And so it was the women of the church who began to give Sarah Breedlove, the illiterate washerwoman, a vision of herself, that that her life could be better. They made sure that her daughter was enrolled in school. When she had to be away from home during the week working, her daughter stayed at the colored orphans' home. She was considered a half orphan. But it was these club women who had been involved in the suffrage movement, who, before there was any sort of social safety net, who were really felt it was their mission to help people, to inspire people. And so they made a huge difference in her life. That was one of the things that was missing from Self-Made. Didn't talk anything about that. But she, you can see that this is what she looked like in the middle picture. She was struggling to raise her daughter. Her brothers, as I say, were barbers, but they weren't wealthy. And so she was just sometimes almost homeless. Her brothers began to die during the 1890s. She had married a man named John Davis who was not very nice to her. And among other things, her hair began to fall out. So, this is that woman's crowning glory. But it was something that was very common at the time when most Americans didn't have electricity or indoor plumbing. People didn't bathe as often, so we don't want to think about that quite a lot, but they also didn't wash their hair very often. Sometimes maybe once a month, sometimes not at all during the winter. And that meant people had really bad scalp infections. And so lots of people were losing their hair. So there's people who are old enough may have heard, did Madam Walker, didn't she invent the hot comb? Well, no, that's a myth, especially among African Americans. She did not invent the hot comb. But so I hear somebody laughing if you ever heard that. I always shock people because that my grandmother said that. It must be true, but it's not true. But she developed a shampoo, encouraged people to wash their hair more often, and then an ointment that was like Vaseline that contained sulfur. And that is a remedy that's centuries old. It really, sulfur healed skin and scalp infections. And that was the secret to her success. She learned a little bit from her brothers who were barbers. She also was for a while a sales agent for the woman who became her major competitor, Annie Malone. But she took that idea and expanded upon it because she was a master marketer. And you can see, and this is her before and after. This is like the Jenny Craig commercials. She really, in the early, advertising was just really in its infancy. But she developed this product, and you can see it actually worked. Clean scalp, it's pretty logical, clean scalp ointment with sulfur, your scalp is healthy, your hair will grow. And when she began to take out ads in the newspaper, she used this before and after image. And she would have testimonials, very much like Jenny Craig, where one woman wrote a letter to her and she said, before I began to use Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower, my hair was 1/8 of an inch long. And now my hair is down my back and I have been able to throw my wig away. But it wasn't just about the hair. Women wanted the hair care products. They needed something that was tailored to them. But she realized as she was training women and traveling all over the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America, that what they needed was education and economic independence. And so one of the letters one woman wrote to her and said, "You have made it possible for a Black woman to make more money in a day selling your products than she could in a month working in somebody's kitchen." And she was such a genius about identifying women who needed to have economic independence. I'm just going to do this. So she moved to St. Louis, as I told you, and just so this was the big city after having been on the plantation. And then this is St. Paul AME Church, which was really quite an amazing edifice, the largest Black AME church that was west of the Mississippi. And it included a Kilgan organ, which was quite state-of-the-art during that period of time. And so poor washerwoman Sarah Breedlove had a good enough voice to be in the choir. So that gave her even more aspirations to be around the middle-class women, the club women. And then this is her wonderful hair grower on the right and her vegetable shampoo. Pretty revolutionary at the time to put her own image on the product. Because there were other companies, some white-owned companies that were selling products to Black women, and their before and after pictures would be pen and ink drawings, and the before picture would be a Black woman with kind of splotchy skin and hair that was kind of askew, and the after picture would be a Gibson girl. So we know most white women couldn't actually look like that Gibson girl in the drawings, but certainly it was an impossible feat for a Black woman. But she had this idea of marketing herself because she was marketing to other women who were just like she was. And as she traveled, this is 1910 now, you see she's moving on up. But she would travel around to different cities. So she moved from St. Louis to Denver in 1905. Her good friend Charles Joseph Walker, who was a newspaper man in St. Louis, joined her in Denver. And they got married. She began to call herself Madam, first Mrs. C.J. Walker in the ads, and then Madam C.J. Walker. And Madam was a title that businesswomen used. So if you look in old newspapers, you'd see somebody who's a seamstress or who runs a boarding house or who's a caterer. And also women who had illegal businesses. But it really did sort of connote business. And it was kind of an affectation, sort of because Paris was the center of fashion. So there were, women who were opera singers, they would use that title, but that gave her, elevated her a bit. But she continued to educate herself. She hired the woman who's sitting directly behind her is Alice Kelly, who was the dean of girls at a black boarding school in Kentucky. She hired her to be the manager of her factory, but in some ways she was also her tutor. Madam Walker did not have a lot of formal education, so she wanted to educate herself. And so she hired somebody who could help her with her grammar, who could help her with her public speaking, who could recommend books that she read. But as she continued to travel around, she was training women. As she left Denver, she and her husband traveled throughout the South and the Southwest. They settled briefly in Pittsburgh. She opened her first beauty school, Lelia College, named after her daughter. And then they moved to Indianapolis in 1910. But as she would go from city to city, to my amazement, in newspapers as early as 1906, there are ads where she's saying, Madam Walker is coming to town and she'll be at this church and these are the dates. And so she was really very, I know she'd be on Instagram now. She was very savvy about this. But she would have a speech where she would show slides. So it's like a PowerPoint presentation, stereopticon. They were glass slides, and she would talk about current events, and she'd show Black schools and institutions and things that were going on. And then she would invite 10 or 12 women to join her in a smaller room, and she would demonstrate the products, and she was recruiting. And she would see which women were asking questions. Who did the other women gravitate towards? Who seemed really to have a spark? And she would make that person her lead agent. And then she would move on to the next city. So over time, she trained literally 20,000 plus women. Here she is in Indianapolis. She arrived in 1910. She moved to Indianapolis, which is where I grew up. And you say, why Indianapolis in 1910? But it had a very thriving Black business community. It had 3 Black newspapers, including one that was nationally distributed, the Indianapolis Freeman, that was kind of like a Black USA Today, with a current events section, a sports section, a cultural section. And she advertised in that paper. She used those testimonials. And because Indianapolis had so many trains running through, it was called the Crossroads of America. The Pullman porters who were going from San Francisco to Boston to Detroit to Atlanta would take the newspapers, and so her ads were being distributed all over the United States. In Indianapolis, she built a factory, and these are her employees in front of the factory. One of the things that became clear to me as I've done this research over many years is that she had a really strong C-suite. She hired a great attorney. And the woman who was the manager of the factory, dean of girls, another great secretary. And because she had such a strong executive team, they were very good about record keeping. And so literally we have 40,000 plus records that have been digitized at the Indiana Historical Society. And that's why I'm able to tell the story with such detail. Her daughter, Alelia, was really the motivation, as children always are for parents. But here they are in Indianapolis. Soon after she arrived in Indianapolis, I'm not sure I have this picture, but I'm going to tell you the story. Soon after she arrived in Indianapolis, there was a big fundraising campaign for a new YMCA in the Black community. The YMCAs were segregated at that point, and the white community had just built a sort of state-of-the-art YMCA with a swimming pool and great facilities. But the YMCA for the Black community was in a rickety old building, not enough meeting rooms. The shower was in a coal shed across the alley. And the basketball floor in Indiana, which has always been a big basketball state, was under regulation size. In fact, it was so small that they had to reduce the number of players from 5 to 3. So clearly they needed a new building. Jessie Moreland, who was the first Black secretary of the YMCA, came to Indianapolis because Julius Rosenwald, the president of Sears Roebuck, had pledged $25,000 to any city in America where the Black and white communities would work together to raise the balance of $75,000 to build a $100,000 facility, which might build half of this room now, but then built a very lovely building. And at the big rally that Jessie Moreland held, some of the white businessmen pledged $10,000, $5,000, $1,000. And to everyone's surprise, Madam Walker stood up and pledged $1,000 to the building fund. And she said, I believe if I help our boys, it will help our girls. And that is what I am interested in. But that was just stunning. No Black woman had ever given that amount of money for that kind of cause. And so now her crowds, as she traveled around, were getting bigger because people wanted to know how this woman who'd been a washerwoman, who was starting to build a business, how was she able to make this kind of pledge? So when she decided that she wanted to go talk about this at Booker T. Washington's 1912 National Negro Business League Convention, she arrives at the convention in her chauffeur-driven car. And she'd met Booker T. Washington, but she was not part of his inner circle. And, you know, when you plan a conference, you've already picked your speakers months in advance. And she sent word to him that she wanted to speak, and he ignored her request. On the second day of the conference, her good friend George Knox, the publisher of the Indianapolis Freeman in Indianapolis and a longtime friend of Booker T. Washington, stood up and said, "We should hear from Madam Walker. She is my friend from Indianapolis, where she pledged $1,000 to the building fund of the YMCA. She has an incredible story to tell." And even though they were friends, Booker T. Washington kind of dismissed Mr. Knox, and he said, "We're discussing lifetime membership." And then he proceeded to call upon someone who was not discussing lifetime membership. In fact, to add insult to injury, he called upon one of Madam Walker's neighbors from Indianapolis, H.L. Saunders. And Mr. Saunders indeed had a very successful business. He manufactured uniforms for people who worked in hotels and in service industries. And he had been the treasurer of the fundraising campaign for the YMCA. His business was a regional business with customers in Indiana and the 4 surrounding states. Well, at this point, Madam Walker's business, just a few years after she founded it, was not just a regional business, but a national business and an international business with customers in the Caribbean and Central America. And as it turns out, her $1,000 gift was 4 times greater than his $250 gift, which was, of course, extremely generous. Now, she was a good church-going woman, so I knew she knew you were not supposed to look in that collection plate when it went by and compare your gifts to others. However, I can't help but imagine that she felt at least a twinge of resentment. But she waited until the 3rd and final day of the conference, as the last banker was making what I'm sure scintillating remarks. She stood at her seat, looked toward Booker T. Washington at the podium, and said, "Surely you are not going to shut the door in my face. I am a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. From there, I was promoted to the wash tub. From there, I was promoted to the kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself. I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations, and I have built my own factory on my own ground." The next year, he invited her back as a keynote speaker. And I will say, despite the inaccuracies in the Netflix series, there was a real respect and friendship between the two of them by the time he died in 1915. And this is Madam Walker's daughter, again, A'Lelia Walker. And you can see she's the apple of her mother's eye. I'm almost finished. I'm editing the last 2 chapters of the first major biography of her, which will be published in early 2024. But you can see she just had a lot of joy. In fact, Langston Hughes called her the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s because of the great parties she gave. But when her mother moved to Indianapolis, she stayed in Pittsburgh to run the beauty school named after her. And part of her territory was New York, Harlem. And she persuaded her mother that they needed to be in the city, just as Harlem was becoming the mecca of politics and culture for African Americans. So she bought this building in the middle on 136th Street. And for those of you who know New York, 135th and Lenox is where the Schomburg is. And right behind that now is the Countee Cullen Library. So this is the block where the Countee Cullen Library was. And soon after she bought that house, they remodeled it into a beautiful salon and living quarters. And they hired Vertner Tandy, the first licensed Black architect in New York, to remodel the house, and bought the house next door and expanded it into this beautiful double townhouse. And this is the salon. They've, of course, hired the best decorators in New York City. And this is the beauty school downstairs. and one of the ads from that period of time. But you can see that they're already, they're now making a lot of money, but they're trying to build homes and businesses that will inspire other people. So and they're hiring a Black architect. So they really want to make a statement, so that when people are writing about what's going on in Harlem, they're always included in the articles. And I think part of the reason that Madam Walker is maybe more remembered than some of her competitors is that even though the business was headquartered in Indianapolis, where it was cheaper to do business, they had this sort of, maybe it was a lost leader, but it was a way, it was like having your salon on Rodeo Drive, or somewhere where people could see it. So now they have a platform that they try to use. And Madam Walker was becoming much more involved in politics. She actually moved her personal residence to New York in 1916. In 1917, she held her first convention of her sales agents in Philadelphia. And she's here in the center. And this had to have been one of the first conventions of women entrepreneurs. And at that convention, she gave prizes not just to the women who sold the most products, but to the women who contributed the most to charity. So Mary Kay was born a couple of years later. That was a model that Madam Walker had engineered and thought about, but also to make sure that people were politically aware. In her keynote, she said to her agents, "I want you to understand that your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others." And at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson, since we're here in Princeton, urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. So you see, it took more than 100 years for that legislation to finally be signed. But she was one of the people, along with leadership in the NAACP and others, who knew that that was something that was necessary. But after she moved to New York in 1916 and into that home that she was sharing with her daughter, I joke and say that house wasn't big enough for two women, and she needed her own space. And so she hired Vertner Tandy again to design Villa Lewaro. So this is the house under construction. She had an opening party. This is the invitation in August of she moved in May of 1918, and she had the opening party in August of 1918 honoring Emmett Scott, who was the Undersecretary for Negro Affairs in the War Department. America is at war at that point. He had been secretary, but really chief of staff for Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee. And she wanted to make sure that he came to the home. And, sort of, because she was very involved in advocating for the rights of African-American soldiers, and she thought it was important, that she said this was a conference of interest to the race, which made Mr. Scott a little nervous because he didn't want to make the Secretary of War, Mr. Baker, or the President Wilson upset, but it was, for her, important to say it's a conference of interest to the race. This is what the music room, she and her daughter loved music. As I say, she was in the choir in St. Louis, even when she was a poor woman, but they were surrounded by, ragtime was being born in St. Louis. The German musicians ran the music departments in the schools, in the Black schools. The classically trained teachers had gone to Oberlin, and there was a mix of both the German musicians and the African-American musicians. Many of the ragtime musicians knew classical music. And so they loved, Madam Walker and her daughter loved opera. In fact, Enrico Caruso named Villa Lewaro. He went to the home as a guest of A'Lelia Walker's when the house was being built, and he said it reminded him of homes in Naples. And so he said, well, let's name it Villa Lewaro, using letters from A'Lelia Walker's name, L-E for Lelia, W-A for Walker, and R-O for John Robinson, the long-departed first husband. But the name stuck. But they loved music, and so even though neither woman played an instrument, they always had live music and made sure that their friends who were musicians, and they knew the best musicians of the era. This is Madam Walker at a party, actually not at Villa Lewaro, but she's like the third or fourth person from the left, actually in Indianapolis, but she loved to have dances and music. And then she died in May of 1919. She moved in May of 1918, was only there for 1 year. And she died there and then is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. you can't really see this, but this is just a prompt for me. I'm a visual learner, so I have to have things. This is the list of pallbearers who were kind of a who's who of African-American men. And then after her death, her daughter became the president of the company here with the strong C-suite. And there's a long story that because I want to get to questions that I only have a couple more minutes, I'm going to speed through this last part. But when Madam Walker died, A'Lelia Walker and my grandmother May were on a trip to Panama doing business development. And they finally got back to New York, but there was a tension between mother and daughter because her daughter had two boyfriends, both doctors, both handsome. One was a good guy and one was a bad boy. And so who did she really like the most? The bad boy, who was appropriately named Dr. Wiley Wilson. So she had told her mother in a letter that she was going to marry Dr. Jack Kennedy. But when she got back, he had been separated but not divorced. And so as she arrived at the train station, she was so distraught and she was really in love with Wiley. So she buried her mother on June 3rd, and on June 6th, her 34th birthday, she married Dr. Wiley Wilson. So here they are in their honeymoon, and there's a long story that's in my new book, but Wiley acted up immediately. And so that's a long story. But the house, but they were, at Villa Lewaro and at her place on 136th Street. But during the 20s, A'Lelia Walker really made Villa Lewaro, even though her mother was really only there for a year, but she was there for another 11, 12 years. And so it's really what happened when she was there that gives the house its identity. And there were a couple of movies that were filmed there. In 1921, she hosted a weekend, 4th of July weekend for Liberian President C.D.B. King, who had come to the United States because the U.S. owed him some money for things that Liberia had done during World War I. He was not invited to come to the White House for dinner, but he was invited to Villa Lewaro. And this was the band Dabney Syncopated Orchestra who played, and with fireworks and the whole shebang. And then in 1923, another one of the sort of iconic moments there was my grandmother's wedding reception. She had gotten married at St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Harlem. And here she is. If you can see, she's not really a very happy bride. She married Dr. Gordon Jackson. Her mother made her marry him, and that marriage did not last. So anyway, that's a whole nother story in my new book. But lots of drama, and I can answer some questions. But this is kind of all the groomsmen are all doctors, lawyers, and dentists. So the best and the brightest. Then in 1924, the Walker Convention, that 1917 convention was the first one. Madam Walker dies in 1919, but in 1924, the Walker agents make a pilgrimage to New York and host a convention. And so I just love this photo. I know, just arrayed around. They had gone to the grave in the Bronx before and then come for a picnic. And then during the 1920s, A'Lelia Walker owned that house. She owned still the townhouse, but she converted the townhouse into a space called the Dark Tower, which during the 20s hosted all of the famous artists, writers, musicians, actors. And it was a meeting place that was a very racially integrated meeting place, which was unusual for the time. This is the invitation to the Dark Tower. And the menu, which includes A'Lelia Walker iced tea. It was Prohibition. I don't know, but I just think you could drop a little something in there. And then she had a pied-à-terre at 80 Edgecombe because Lenox Avenue was getting too busy. And she really was a toast of the Harlem Renaissance. Here she is with some friends at Villa Lewaro out in the back, and then in the music room. Oh, I had that twice, okay. And then she died in August of 1931 at 46 years old, quite young. But you can see it was a huge funeral. And so now as I say, I'm almost finished with the first major biography of her. I'm really eager for her story to be out there. That when I was beginning my research on Madam Walker, I was dealing with like this much, and people had filled the vacuum with a lot of stories that weren't true. And the same thing has happened with Aurelia Walker. She's really been flattened and caricatured, and I'm really eager for people to know this woman who Langston Hughes called the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s. So before we take questions, I'll just leave you with some words from Madam Walker. She said that people often ask her the secret to her success. And she would say to them, there is no royal, flower-strewn path to success. And if there is, I have not found it. For whatever success I have attained has been the result of much hard work and many sleepless nights. I got my start by giving myself a start. So don't sit down and wait for the opportunities to come. You have to get up and make them for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we have some time for questions. The only rule that we have here for Q&A is if you don't mind speaking your question into the microphone here, so folks at home can hear, that would be most helpful. So any questions?
Could you, she was your great-grandmother. Could you tell us a little bit about your grandmother and your mother?
Sure, that's right, because this is really about the house, and so that's a different lecture, but yes, absolutely. So my grandmother, May, gosh, and I didn't even put a picture of her in here. That's not good. So my grandmother, May, was adopted by Aurelia Walker. And it's a sort of a Cinderella story. May had very long braids, and Madam Walker's main product was wonderful hair grower. And the way that they became connected, when Madam Walker, still Sarah Breed Love McWilliams, was living in St. Louis with her daughter, they belonged to St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. One of the other members was a man named Elijah Hammond that they had known. He happened to live next door to the choir director, who was also Madam Walker's daughter's vice principal of her school. And Elijah Hammond was from Indiana, and he moved back to Indiana. And when Madam Walker arrived in Indianapolis in 1910, his mother lived across the alley from her, Samira Thomas. And Samira gathered her 8 children and their children to her home in Indianapolis. They were living in a community called Noblesville. And one of Elijah's sisters, the daughter of Samira Thomas, was a woman named Sarah, also named Sarah. And she had just become widowed with 8 children, the third generation of women to be widowed with 8 children. And one of her children was May. So May would come visit her grandmother, and she would run errands for the women in the factory. And then because of this long hair, Madam Walker started using her as a model. And then she began to travel around with Madam Walker. And they had, helped a lot of young people, but they offered to legally adopt May, to let her still stay in touch with her biological family. Her mother was still living. Her brother and sister eventually worked for the company, but she became legally adopted by them. Aurelia Walker was married 3 times to both Wiley Wilson and Jack Kennedy. That's the details of that story. But she never had any biological children. So that's May. And then May's first husband, the evil Dr. Gordon Jackson, they had 1 child, my Uncle Walker, but they divorced fairly quickly. And then May married my grandfather, Marion Perry, and they had 1 daughter who was my mother, whose name was Aurelia May Perry Bundles, and I'm Aurelia Perry Bundles. So 4 generations of women in my family were executives of the Walker Company. When I was growing up, my mom was vice president of the Walker Company. And May had died when my mother was a freshman at Howard in 1945. But my mother majored in chemistry and business because she knew that she was going into the family business. Now, with my generation, both of my parents worked in the hair care business. My dad worked for a while for the Walker Company. But he was so good as a sales manager that he was hired away to be president of a competitor company. But that point, the Walker Company was still in existence, but it was not really keeping up. And it was sort of this, as we know about disruption with newspapers and internet and all that, the Walker Company, the Poro Company, and the Apex Company were companies that were founded in the early 1900s by women. And they used what was sort of the traditional press and curl way of doing hair. And then chemical hair straighteners began to disrupt that market. And my dad became president of one of those companies. So his company was the more successful as I was growing up. But for me, I worked in his office during the summer, but my parents knew that I needed to find my own path. My mom had felt pressured, though she made the best of it, I think, working for the company. But my passion was writing. Both of my parents were really excellent writers, but that wasn't the path that they were able to take. And so they encouraged me to follow my dreams to become a journalist. And then, to make this long story longer, when I was at graduate school at Columbia, assuming I'm becoming a journalist, my advisor was a woman named Phyllis Garland, who was the only Black woman on the faculty. This is the fall of 1975. And Phil was my master's paper advisor. We sat down, we talked about topics. I gave her some very cliched topics, as graduate students do when they don't really have much imagination. And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker?" And so that was absolutely the last thing that I was trying to tell people about. And I said, "Yeah, that's my family." And she said, "That's what you're going to write your paper about." So that was 1975. And I'm so glad she did. I was able to go on and do my career at ABC and NBC, but as I was learning to be a storyteller, and as I was learning to, speak in public and do all of those things, I was gaining the skills that allow me to tell the story. I know it was a long answer.
Other questions?
Getting your steps in.
Yeah, right.
I walked to the Wawa today, so I got some of my steps in.
I was wondering if the house still exists, and is it a privately owned house?
So you must have come in a little bit late. I don't know if you were, but anyway. But yes, the house absolutely is there. I was in the house 2 weeks ago. I was in Irvington last night, but I was in the house 2 weeks ago because Eileen Fisher, my favorite designer, Eileen Fisher's office is in Irvington. So have you shopped there? I can see a nod. But for Black History Month, some of the employees came over for a tour. So it's now owned by Richelieu Dennis, and it's because there's a lot of work being done, and it's not a house museum because the original furnishings are not there, but it's in the process of being restored. So small groups can come, like the Girl Scouts have been there, Delta Sigma Theta has been there, Jack and Jill. So there's been small groups who are able to come tour. But the sort of the rules from the Village of Irvington are that it can't be a really big event. So we're quietly doing that, but it's just a joy when people come through. It was a designer show house for the United Negro College Fund in 1998, and literally thousands of people came through the house. And I still meet people today who say, "Oh, I was in the house," and what it meant. But it's a very, when you walk through that door, I mean, I never am, not awed when I walk in. The hand-painted coffered ceilings, a lot of, the original floors are there. A lot of the original light fixtures are there. So you get a sense of what the scale of the house was. And it's not huge, it's not overwhelming. The rooms are kind of a manageable size, and you can see, she called it her dream of dreams. You can see why she wanted to be there. And you think that she was, born on the Mississippi River, looking at the bluffs of Vicksburg, and then she's looking at the Palisades of New Jersey. I mean, initially she owned the property almost all the way down to the river and that, beautiful sunset. Now there are a lot of trees that are growing up, but yes, it is privately owned. It's always been a privately owned home, but I think Richelieu Dennis's vision for the house because he's now investing in so many businesses, especially women-owned businesses, that it will be kind of a gathering center for the people who go through his New Voices Fund, so that it can serve as inspiration for them. So thank you for asking.
Have one back here.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. Great storytelling. It's
Thank
really
you.
great. I may have missed it, but what did Madam Walker's husbands do?
Good question.
Were they just marrying somebody wealthy?
No, it's a good, there's so many, there are things that when you tell the story many times, there are things like basic things like, what was her name when she was born? So I actually did, I did say that, Sarah Breedlove. So her first husband, Moses McWilliams, was a laborer, farm worker during the, on a plantation during the late 1800s. And he died. And we really don't know the reason because there's, there are no death certificates. Even though people who like to make up stories have said, oh, he was killed in a race riot, but that's, really made up and dramatic. Then the second husband, John Davis, was someone she met after she moved to St. Louis. And he was, he was a laborer, but he was not a very nice guy. I mean, I do have some of the depositions from her efforts to divorce him. So I can tell her friends are saying he was not nice. So I have a little bit about him. And with Ancestry.com, you're able to find a few things. But they actually separated and didn't really divorce because she didn't think she was going to become Madam C.J. Walker. So that created a problem years later. But Charles Joseph Walker is someone who, had aspirations as she did, and they really were working together as she was starting the business. And so he did have a lot of the skills, advertising skills and marketing skills that were very helpful, but he didn't have as much ambition as she. And so when she told a reporter, when I began to make, $10 a week, my husband thought that was enough, but I knew that I had a business that could be bigger. And then she said, and due to his narrowness of vision, we parted ways. But the truth is, and one of the only things in the Netflix series that's actually accurate is that he did have an affair with one of her agents. But Blair Underwood is a lovely man, I will tell you. He is a very, very nice man. He and Octavia were two of the bright spots for me.
It was told she is the first woman millionaire in the United States.
So here's how we parse that. So I am, and I'm just going to tell you this, I have a friend, Tyrone McKinley Freeman, who is a professor at Indiana University School of Philanthropy. And I met him when he was working on his dissertation 10 or 15 years ago. And he's now written a really spectacular book called Madam Walker's Gospel of Giving, where he does an even deeper dive than I do into her philanthropy and her role as an educator. But Tyrone and I joke about the millionaire sweepstakes because there are a lot of, who was the first, the this and the that. And sometimes people say she was the first American millionaire. I'm like, no, there were some Vanderbilts and and some other people before that. So because because in America we care about who the millionaires are. But the way that I parse this, because I'm a journalist and I'm a fact-driven person, is that we can document the value of her estate when she died in 1919 because she had this great attorney who kept really meticulous records down to the penny. So we know that her personal assets were worth somewhere between $600,000 and $700,000, and the value of her business based on the sales of the last few years of her life, the value of the business was somewhere between $1 million and $2 million. There are other people who may very well have been millionaires, but you can't document it. And we have, the receipts, as they say. So that's how we say that. And the Guinness Book of World Records says that she is the first American self-made woman millionaire. Obviously, married people inherited it, et cetera. So there's the parsing. It's a long answer.
Oh, thank you.
trot over, sorry. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you for a wonderful presentation. I have two questions for you. One, in today's dollars, how much money is that? And then two, if you know the answer to that question. And two, when and how was the decision made to give up the family residence? Like, how did you come, how did the family come to that decision?
So I would just ask all of you who have smartphones, all you have to, there's a calculator that allows you to figure that out. And it changes, every time as I'm writing this book, I'm saying in today's dollars. So I don't know off the top of my head, but you can, there's a calculator that makes it really easy to figure that out. So if you just put $1 million in 1919 dollars, today's dollars, and you can, before we leave, somebody can tell me what the answer to that is. So the ownership of the house, so the provenance of it in a sense. So in Madam Walker's will, well, I'll back up a little bit and say she was an early preservationist. She gave the largest gift to buy the Frederick Douglass home in Washington, D.C., because that was getting ready to be lost. And it was the group, the National Association of Colored Women, these club women who had helped her when she was still a poor washerwoman. She was now a member and one of the most prominent members. And at their convention in 1918, she's the one who held the candle to the mortgage that paid off Frederick Douglass's home. So that was a great deal of pride for her to be able to preserve the home of someone she so admired. So when she built Villa Lewaro, she was building it, she said, to inspire young Black boys and girls. And she wanted to make sure that it was preserved. So her will said that her daughter had a lifetime interest in Villa Lewaro, and that upon her daughter's death, the house would be donated to the NAACP, or I think the phrase was, or whatever organization is doing the most for the race. A'Lelia Walker died in 1931 at the height of the Depression. And so the taxes and the upkeep were so great that it really was not feasible for them to keep it. So the house they auctioned off a lot of the contents of the house, and the house was sold. And of course, it's the Depression, so you couldn't get very much money. So the Companions of the Forest, a women's organization, bought the house, and they used it initially for, they said, sort of a retreat for some of their members. And then by the time I finally visited the house, in the late 70s or early 80s, there were just a few women living there to become a retirement home. And they owned it until sometime in the 80s. Ingo and Darlene Appel bought the house. They owned it until 1993, when Harold and Helena Doley bought the house, and then Richelieu Dennis's family bought the house. So it's had not had that many owners, but it wasn't our choice. I do have a picture of my mother as a little girl on the grass visiting the house. She was born in 1928, so I know she was there.
All right, I think we have time, sorry, I'm in the back here. I think we have time for one more question of my colleague Grant here.
We're gonna call on you too. After his question, then Mr. Hilton gets to ask a question.
I'm interested to know more. Pardon me.
No, we're gonna let him with the microphone, and then we'll come to you. We need you on the microphone.
Yeah. I was just hoping you could just briefly touch on, you alluded to it a little bit, about the process of turning your book into the Netflix series. It sounds like there's some, maybe a little bit of
drama,
some gossip there that I just like to see, and what that process was like.
Right, so I'm gonna make a short answer, but I will say, if you are on Twitter, some of us are trying not to be there anymore, but pinned to the top of my Twitter feed, @AleliaBundles, I have a long article that I did. The short story is that I was so excited when Octavia Spencer was named to it. I went with a producer who I thought would respect the story. But as you know, as often happens, the writers and the showrunners had a really different vision than mine. I gave lots of notes, as they say in Hollywood, because I did not like the direction they decided to lean into, a kind of cliched cat fight between two women. They introduced colorism as the conflict between the women, had nothing to do with that. And I just think they sort of missed the point of women helping women, which is really what Madam Walker's life was. And at the same time, as I say, Octavia Spencer, I loved every time she came on screen, but she couldn't overcome the script, because the script was the script. But I've a lot of lessons learned. I'm working on some other projects where I'm working with the writer this time. All right.
Thanks.
I'd just like to know something else about the architect. Was his name Tandy?
Right, Vertner Tandy.
How would you learn more about him? Is he?
You know, this is really a challenge. So Vertner Tandy went to Tuskegee and I think Cornell, first licensed Black architect in New York, designed St. Philip's Church in Harlem, had some other really amazing designs, but none of his papers exist. There's a dissertation that was written maybe 30 or 40 years ago. We can't find any of the blueprints. Steve Tilley, the architect who's doing the restoration, it's like last night we had dinner and he's like, if we could only find those papers, but his family did not save any papers, hence my advocacy of save your papers. I will say he also was a founder of one of the most well-known Black fraternities, Alpha Phi Alpha. So it's, you know, he's a very interesting life. We just don't have, there's just not a lot to work with in terms of telling his story.
Well, thank you so much, Alilia. That was an incredible, as Louise said, such wonderful storytelling and just a really, really special evening. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you all. We are going to get sorted up here to sign some books. I'm going to sneak out and be available to sell books if you'd like to purchase some of the books in the lobby there. And just thank you all so much, and thank you, Alilia.
Thank you very much.